The Black Hawk's red cabin light barely touched the two women's faces inside. From outside, they probably looked like nothing more than two soulless silhouettes. But in here, there was a quiet, almost telepathic partnership at play. Commandos caught behind enemy lines were counting on them. As the helicopter began its descent, at that moment when the radios suddenly went silent and hope seemed to be slipping away, everyone's eyes seemed to gravitate toward one particular woman, Quinn, who, to be honest, looked a little too young for such a mission. Everyone watched her every move, yet she seemed to be watching only one other person, because the real danger, it appeared, wasn't lurking outside, it was already inside. Sometimes the biggest threat is the one standing closest to you. This, it turns out, was a story where a hostage rescue operation unexpectedly spiraled into a twisted tale of betrayal and ultimately a desperate fight for survival. Just one woman's nagging suspicion, you might find, was enough to potentially save an entire team's life. This whole narrative, it seems, is really about how true strength, raw courage, and keen intuition aren't defined by outward appearances, but by how brightly they can truly shine from within. The very essence of our channel, you could say, lies in those silent heroes who manage to change the world without leaving a trace. If these kinds of stories deeply resonate with you, consider subscribing for more and hitting that notification bell. That red glow inside the Black Hawk felt almost oppressive, just barely illuminating their faces. The constant low hum of the rotors seemed to press down around them, dulling every other sound, or so it felt. Quinn sat ramrod straight against the cabin wall, her gloved hands resting calmly over the straps of her plate carrier. No one really spoke. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't been gone over a dozen times already. Despite the night air, sweat still clung stubbornly beneath all the gear. Every single man on her team had by now probably double-checked their weapons multiple times, resecured any loose pouches, and perhaps even closed their eyes for a brief moment or two, not to truly rest, but to simply clear their minds. The crew chief gave a quiet thumbs up. Quinn acknowledged it with a single firm nod. She didn't actually need to look to know they were descending. She could just feel it in her bones. The pitch of the rotors shifted, the bird dipped ever so slightly to starboard, then held its course, precisely as planned. The second Black Hawk flew parallel, off their right flank, a dark, barely visible shadow. You might just catch a faint shimmer where its tail rotor caught a sliver of moonlight below, otherwise it was lights out. The jungle below reached up, a vast, black, undulating ocean. They were now 5 minutes from the drop point. With a practiced hand, Quinn checked her night vision goggles and smoothly shifted them down into place. The world immediately bled into an eerie tapestry of green shadows. She blinked once, held perfectly still, and calmly watched the terrain unfurl beneath them. The trees seemed to ripple in the wind created by the rotors. Leaves fluttered, and narrow spirals of dust, almost like tiny ghosts, kicked upward before vanishing into the dense canopy. Nobody moved, only the low hum of the engine, that steady pulse of steel, and the quiet rhythm of their own breathing filled the air. The plan was, on the surface, quite simple: a silent insertion, move through a pre-identified corridor, heading straight for the compound's perimeter. No lights and no gunfire unless it was absolutely unavoidable. Satellite and signal intercepts had confirmed 4 hostages, all civilians, all apparently alive within the last 24 hours, held for reasons that seemed more diplomatic than anything else. The compound itself was tucked away deep within enemy-held jungle, protected by what appeared to be staggered foot patrols. The enemy likely didn't expect a team to drop in from above. Quinn, however, never expected the enemy to be stupid either. At just 1 minute out, she lifted a closed fist. Her team shifted, a single fluid motion. Gloves checked ropes, weapons were snuggled tighter to chests, and carabiners snapped securely into harness lines. The sounds were mechanical, almost hushed, and incredibly precise. The crew chief mouthed a silent countdown. 10, then 5. The ropes dropped from both sides. Quinn was, as expected, the first one down. Her boots touched the earth with little more than a whisper and a faint puff of dirt. She instantly released the rope, cleared the landing zone, and seamlessly turned, her weapon already raised, to sweep the brush line. Nothing. The jungle around them still seemed to be holding its breath. The next man touched down right behind her, then another. Within mere seconds, the entire team was on the ground. She motioned forward with 2 fingers, no words needed. They vanished into the foliage like literal ghosts. The jungle, as expected, was thick and damp. Vines, like heavy ropes, hung from trees that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Leaves brushed their shoulders, and gnarled roots clawed out of the dirt, almost like grasping arms reaching for their ankles. The team maintained a precise wedge formation, moving slowly but steadily. Their boots sank just slightly into the soft earth with each step. They used no lights, relying entirely on their optics and honed muscle memory. Every man knew the map, every route having been virtually walked on screen until it felt as familiar as terrain they had physically touched. Quinn positioned herself in the center of the formation, adjusting her line every few steps, constantly checking the edges. Her hand signals were fluid, almost instinctual. Halt, shift, watch right, eyes. The only sounds were the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional, almost imperceptible call of insects. They moved on, passing over a dry stream bed before scaling a shallow rise. At the top, they dropped flat, immediately scanning the ridge ahead. And there it was. The compound sat low, spreading out like a rusted, tangled maze, corrugated tin roofs, drab cement walls, and a perimeter barely illuminated by just 2 flickering bulbs mounted precariously on wooden posts. The air carried a faint scent of oil and heat. A single sentry walked the inside of the fence, his rifle slung somewhat carelessly. But something about his steps, something almost imperceptible, snagged Quinn's attention. Too even, perhaps. With absolutely no side-to-side glances, he seemed to be pacing, not genuinely watching, and the spacing between guard movements simply didn't vary. She narrowed her eyes, observing how the shadows shifted in perfect sync with his footsteps. Another guard on the opposite side crossed at the exact same interval. It was all just too predictable, too patterned. No real guard, in her experience, should move that mechanically. She raised her hand, giving the silent signal to freeze. The team as one instantly halted. Not a shuffle, not a single ragged breath, just complete stillness. Quinn simply stared at the movement inside the compound for a moment longer, her jaw clenched ever so slightly. Something was definitely off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it yet, but she'd seen enough failed rescues, enough meticulously laid traps, enough patterns that were just too perfect to ignore. She waited another full minute. Nothing changed. The compound's guard pattern cycled through again. Same steps, same angles. She slowly lowered her hands, then remained perfectly still. The team stayed prone at the tree line, maintaining their watch, listening intently through their headsets. No one spoke. They were on signal mute unless, of course, they were fired upon. Every movement from this point onward, it appeared, had to be purely visual, and every single mistake would likely be permanent. Quinn tapped the butt of her rifle once against the ground, a subtle signal to her left element to hold perimeter. Then her eyes shifted to the lead man on her right. He gave a single nod, still no verbal command needed. She watched the guards cycle a 4th time, still unsettlingly, too perfect. Her fingers went up again, this time with her palm open. Stop. Everyone froze, and then the jungle around them went completely unnervingly still. Quinn didn't even blink. Her eyes remained locked on the patrol. Something about the way the lead guard's boots struck the gravel just felt too measured. Not enough variation, no hint of fatigue, no sign of distraction or even the slightest adjustment to the environment. It really looked as if someone was running a drill, not guarding actual prisoners. She didn't voice this thought, not yet, but her gut was screaming that they weren't just late for a rescue. They might be walking straight into something they were never meant to walk out of, and she was absolutely not going to let that happen. Quinn remained motionless for nearly 30 seconds. The compound ahead stayed exactly the same, its perimeter still governed by the same robotic pacing of guards that hadn't shifted even once since she first laid eyes on them. That simply wasn't normal. Even when exhausted, real people vary their steps, their pace, their glances. What she was seeing looked, to her, like choreography, intentional, rehearsed, and frankly too perfect to trust. She kept that thought to herself, then gave a subtle flick of 2 fingers to the forward element. The team adjusted their formation with quiet precision. Still no words exchanged. They repositioned themselves in the underbrush, just beyond the compound fence line, about 20 meters ahead. An enemy patrol, it seemed, was moving directly toward them. 3 men in a loose formation. Their rifles carried more like dead weight than a ready threat. Their discipline, it appeared, was strikingly low, and that, she knew, would likely cost them. Quinn adjusted her grip on her rifle and subtly signaled go. 3 suppressed shots answered almost immediately. The first man dropped sideways into the weeds, never even realizing what hit him. The second stumbled forward from the impact to his spine, his limbs going loose before he even reached the ground. The third barely had time to register anything at all before his knees buckled and he simply collapsed. No alarm, no sound carried beyond the tree line. The jungle instantly reclaimed its silence. The team moved. 2 seals crawled forward, efficiently clearing the bodies from their path, while the others covered high and low angles. Quinn led the breach element along the northern fence, right where a gap had been noted from satellite imagery. It was still there, a space between 2 rusted poles just wide enough for one body to slip through at a time. They slipped through. Inside, the terrain felt much tighter. Buildings seemed to press in close together, their low ceilings and corrugated siding creating narrow, almost claustrophobic kill zones. The team methodically cleared each corridor in rotation, leapfrogging from room to room, always ensuring overlapping fields of fire. Flashlights remained off. They relied solely on their night optics. It was a world of stark green contrast and shifting silhouettes. The air felt stale, heavy with the scent of mildew, oil, and the faint, persistent smoke from an old generator humming somewhere behind a storage shed. 2 guards unexpectedly emerged near the barrack structure. Quinn dropped the first with a quick 3-round burst from about 15 feet out. The second turned, likely saw some movement, but lifted his weapon far too slowly. He went down quickly from a round to the chest and another to the neck. The seal behind her efficiently dragged both bodies into a side room and shut the door without a single word. They finally reached the southernmost building, a square concrete block with a metal door that was securely bolted shut. Quinn gave the hand signal to stack. 1 seal moved up, carefully examined the hinges and nodded. Another produced a compact breach tool and with practiced ease quietly forced the lock. The door opened with a low grudging groan. Quinn swept in first. The interior was dim, devoid of any real light. There was just the faintest, almost ethereal glow from a battery-powered lamp set near the rear. 4 hostages sat slumped against the far wall, their hands bound, blindfolds pulled tight across their faces. They remained motionless. One made a muffled noise through the cloth tied over his mouth. Another twitched slightly as the faint light touched his eyes. One by one, the seals approached and methodically cleared the space. No traps, no hidden guards. The hostages all had zip ties on their wrists. Their clothes were dirty, and their expressions seemed hollow, devoid of hope, all except for one. Quinn's gaze seemed to fixate on the third man. He wasn't struggling, wasn't looking around in confusion like the others. His breathing, even with the blindfold, was just too calm. He sat noticeably straighter than the others, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that simply didn't match the raw adrenaline she could sense in the rest. His boots were surprisingly clean and the hem of his shirt wasn't frayed. Then she noticed a dark stain under the edge of his collar, smaller than the blood smears on the others, almost more controlled. She didn't speak. She just moved. Each hostage was gently pulled upright and guided toward the door. Zip ties were quickly clipped off and their mouths were untied, but the blindfolds remained in place until they were safely out of the structure. Quinn gestured to the rear team to cover their exfil movement. Her second-in-command whispered a checkpoint status, all clear. They exited the building in 2 files, moving swiftly toward the fallback route, a narrow slope where the terrain opened up just enough for a safe extraction staging. The evac bird was scheduled to arrive in just 10 minutes. As they reached the very edge of the compound, a distant burst of gunfire suddenly cracked through the jungle. It came from the east, not close enough to be an immediate threat, but certainly not far enough to simply ignore. The lead seal dropped to a knee and the others quickly spread out, watching the tree line intently. Quinn held her position and listened carefully. Another burst, shorter this time, then silence again. She clicked her radio to receive and all she heard was static. No contact from the bird yet. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. She motioned to shift their formation westward. If that returning patrol had seen anything, they were undoubtedly calling it in already. They moved in staggered intervals. No flashlights, the jungle seemed to swallow them whole again as they slipped beneath hanging vines and carefully stepped over broken roots. The hostages moved slowly, clearly unaccustomed to the rough terrain. One stumbled but was quickly caught by a seal without making a sound. Quinn, however, kept her eyes fixed on the calm man. He hadn't tripped, hadn't hesitated even once. He stepped like someone who had walked this terrain before, even with a blindfold on. His movements were, frankly, too measured. Then it happened. A soft click, almost imperceptible above the ambient night noise, too faint for most to hear, but she definitely caught it. A radio activation. It emanated from his direction, not from a SEAL, not from any side unit. No one else was broadcasting. Quinn immediately stopped walking. She didn't react outwardly, didn't speak, but she turned just slightly, her eyes narrowing behind her optics, staring intently at the man's torso. Nothing visible, nothing obvious, but the click had occurred. She didn't need proof. Not yet. The patrol was still approaching and the evac bird hadn't landed. The calm hostage moved forward again as if absolutely nothing had changed. Quinn still led him, but now she wasn't watching the trees anymore. She was watching him, and nothing in her posture betrayed what she already knew. The ravine, a narrow, steep-sided cut in the earth, was just deep enough to force the team into a staggered column as they moved single file along the dry creek bed. Tree roots jutted out from both banks, menacingly, and moss-covered stones made the footing treacherously slick. The jungle around them seemed to press in tighter with each step, branches bending low, and the oppressive humidity clinging to their gear like glue. Quinn moved third in line, her eyes fixed forward but constantly tracking any movement to her left and right. The hostages were in the middle, flanked by 2 SEALs. The calm man was still calm, almost unnervingly so. She had just shifted her attention to the tree line when it happened. The blast hit without the slightest warning. The lead SEAL vanished in a sudden blur of dust and blinding light. The ground literally jumped, and a sharp concussive crack snapped through the air, followed by a wave that forcefully knocked everyone backward. Intense heat rolled out in a tight, suffocating circle. Quinn hit the dirt hard, her shoulder slamming into a wet rock, her ears ringing violently. Then, an eerie stillness. No screams yet, just groans and muffled coughing through the smoke. Quinn pushed up onto one knee, scanning rapidly. 2 men were down, one motionless, the other moving but with blood quickly spreading across his left thigh. The rest of the team appeared shaken but were recovering quickly. No one needed to say it, it was an IED and clearly not an old one. The placement felt fresh, no way it had been there for long. They had walked this exact route before, meticulously mapping it from the satellite model, which could only mean one thing: someone had known their path in real time. Quinn's first order was a sharp shout, "Perimeter now!" The team immediately scattered to take cover. The medic dropped next to the wounded and began triage without hesitation. Quinn quickly pulled the nearest hostage behind a large boulder and swung her rifle toward the trees. Then she saw him. The calm man hadn't moved. His face was expressionless. He crouched beside a fallen log, his eyes fixed forward, his body language just utterly wrong. He wasn't watching the medic, wasn't looking for danger. He was observing, calculating. That's when Quinn finally moved. She crossed the few feet between them in utter silence and, with a swift, decisive motion, yanked his collar open. Beneath the shirt, just at the edge of his shoulder blade, was the unmistakable mark. An inked triangle. It wasn't military, wasn't national. It was something very specific. She had seen it only once before, on an insurgent document recovered overseas. A unit-level mark that had burned itself into her memory. Her hand instinctively reached for her sidearm, but she was a second, perhaps even less, too late. He lunged sideways, ripped a suppressed pistol from the wounded SEAL's belt, and fired twice. One shot hit the dirt. The second struck a team member just above the hip. Chaos erupted. Quinn tackled him hard, and they hit the ground in a tangled heap. The weapon twisted dangerously between them. She managed to get her elbow into his neck, driving it down forcefully. His hand opened and the pistol clattered to the ground. She rolled him once and used her full weight to pin him quickly to his spine. No one said a word. The rest of the team snapped back into position, their weapons covering their arcs, eyes glued to the tree line. The man on the ground thrashed once, then went completely still. Quinn looked around. The shot SEAL, though bleeding, was conscious. He gave a single nod, his hand pressed tightly to his side. The medic was already moving, working fast. Then came the next, even bigger problem. Gunfire suddenly opened up from the jungle to the south. Controlled bursts, well-spaced, definitely not panic fire. The enemy, it seemed, was coming. Quinn raised her rifle and fired 3 quick rounds toward the muzzle flashes. One found a tree, the other 2 silenced a shape in the foliage. More movement followed, more shadowy silhouettes. She reached for her radio. "Ridge team, be advised. Enemy elements in contact. We've been compromised. The voice on the other end was calm, almost clipped. Copy. Black Hawk is en route, 7 minutes out. Quinn looked at the wounded. One couldn't walk. Another was still groggy, likely concussed. The hostages were physically still in one piece, but visibly shaken now. The calm man, the traitor, was still pinned under her boot. She could feel his steady breathing. She holstered her weapon and lifted off him just long enough to drag him quickly behind cover. No time for questions, not now. The gunfire grew louder, more insistent. She pulled her team back 5 meters and positioned them in a wedge formation behind rocks and fallen trees. Defensive posture. The ravine offered minimal elevation, but it would be enough to slow down any frontal assault. She assigned fields of fire with brief, precise gestures. No one spoke. Every man, it seemed, knew exactly what to do. Rounds began to spark off stone. Leaves shredded in violent bursts, and smoke started to collect low in the air as dust kicked up from the dry ground with every impact. Quinn kept her eyes fixed on the ridge. The enemy was clear. Wanted them pinned right here. The IED had been pure bait, and the traitor's message had most likely activated this whole ambush. The route they were on had been expertly turned into a deadly trap. She quickly changed frequencies on her radio. Black Hawk, this is Iron Shadow. Primary LZ compromised. Request reroute. The answer came back fast. Received. Recommend LZ Bravo 2. 400 meters north. Quinn acknowledged. Be advised. Hostile presence confirmed, near perimeter. She quickly marked the new direction. That meant moving uphill through dense, broken jungle, all while dragging wounded men, guarding civilians and simultaneously staying under heavy fire. She glanced at her second-in-command, who gave a small, understanding nod. Then she moved again, back to the traitor's position. She quickly checked his pockets, finding a comms device, still warm to the touch. He had transmitted less than a minute before the blast, probably giving final confirmation once they were safely in the ravine. She looked into his face one last time. He didn't speak, and neither did she. A single decisive strike with the butt of her rifle ended the problem. No questions asked, no debate. Then she turned back to her team. The wounded was stable, thankfully, but one would definitely need to be carried. She rolled her shoulders once, then, with surprising ease, lifted the downed man into a fireman's carry and started up the treacherous slope. 7 minutes to hold their ground, 400 meters to cover. And now, they weren't just running from enemy fire. They were running from a brutal betrayal that none of them had seen coming, except perhaps Quinn. And she was not, absolutely not, going to let that be the final move made tonight. They reached the ridge just moments before the second wave of enemy fighters. Quinn, with a grunt, hauled the wounded SEAL over the final crest and gently laid him flat between 2 moss-covered rocks. The others moved with practiced speed, securing their sectors, ensuring overlapping arcs of fire. Weapons were raised, covering both the steep slope they had just ascended and the winding gulch that curled southward below. The jungle hissed eerily in the dark, and smoke from the earlier fight drifted uphill in lazy, thin threads, hanging low to the ground. The ridge itself was narrow but seemed solid enough. On the far side, the terrain dropped off sharply again, dense with brush, a shallow gully, and plenty of blind ground that, if timed just right, could offer an escape route. For now, it would serve as a deadly kill funnel. Quinn pointed to a downed log, and the sniper immediately took position, prone behind it, his scope already tracking any motion through the smoky haze. The medic went to work fast, with grim determination. One SEAL was still bleeding heavily from his hip. Another groaned, clearly with a fractured collarbone, but he was lucid and awake. The hostages huddled nervously in the center of the formation, still shaking, still disoriented. None of them uttered a single word. Quinn kept her eyes locked on the tree line. Movement. A single shape darted between trees on the left flank, then another. No clear formation, just probes, fast and low, testing their angles. Quinn didn't fire. and neither did her team. Patience was absolutely critical now. Ammunition was finite, and the element of surprise still held significant weight. She dropped into cover and pulled the enemy radio from her pocket. The device was scuffed, showing signs of heat warping from the earlier skirmish, but it still worked. She quickly toggled through frequency bands, checked encryption, and scrolled through pre-programmed messages. Most were simple coordinates. A few were confirmations, but one message stood out. It had been triggered 20 minutes prior, just before the IED detonated. Translated cleanly: hold them in the ravine. Gunships en route. She stared at the screen for a few seconds longer. That, it seemed, was the enemy's ultimate plan. The traitor's broadcast had, in essence, set the trap. The enemy had no intention of actually retaking the hostages. They were simply buying time to eliminate the entire team. Quinn didn't outwardly react. She simply shut the device off and tucked it back into her vest. Then she adjusted her position, signaling her second-in-command to rotate the defensive line. The left flank held steady, while the right side adjusted forward by 2 meters to close a blind spot. They moved like well-oiled machines. No chatter, no hesitation. More movement appeared below. 2 enemy fighters sprinted into the open just long enough to raise their rifles and fire. Muzzle flashes cracked like sharp lightning bolts. Quinn's sniper expertly put both down with just 3 rounds. Another burst of gunfire swept across the center position, peppering the rock where the medic was crouched. No one was hit, but the message was undeniably clear. They were flanked on both sides, and the enemy was aggressively probing for weakness. Quinn turned toward the gulch. That specific terrain hadn't been on the primary evac list. It was a tough route, tight quarters, promising slower movement, but it was also unmonitored, and no one would likely expect them to risk moving there with both hostages and wounded team members. She checked the time again. The Black Hawk was due in 4 minutes. Not enough. She pulled out the team's encrypted radio and quickly keyed in the alternate LZ. A few seconds later, the response crackled back. Copy, LZ Bravo acknowledged. 100 seconds to intercept window. Clear sight for touch. Quinn looked across the ridge. The gulch would offer them cover, but they absolutely had to draw the enemy's fire away first. A decoy movement, just enough to sell it. Her second-in-command moved beside her. "I'll take the decoy," he stated, not arguing, just a simple declaration. Quinn shook her head. "No." He stared at her for a moment, then looked away, offering no protest. She pointed to the gulch route, marked 2 approach lines, and designated specific fields of suppression fire. 2 SEALs would lay smoke and rotate their fire toward the ridge crest. 2 others would move the hostages down through the brush, with 1 wounded man on a shoulder carry. The medic would follow, covering the rear. She, Quinn, would stay. She didn't repeat it. She simply pulled her weapon closer, checked her remaining rounds, and signaled the countdown. The team moved in unison instantly. Smoke canisters popped along the crest, their white columns mingling with the lingering haze rising from the jungle floor. The moment the smoke thickened, Quinn opened fire into the tree line. Controlled burst. She wasn't aiming to hit anyone. She was simply drawing their attention. The enemy responded. Gunfire exploded across the slope, bullets punching into bark and clipping leaves overhead. 2 more shapes broke cover, charging forward, but were cut down before they even reached the rocks. Quinn kept firing, constantly shifting positions every 5 seconds, never staying behind the same cover for long. Movement, she knew, saved lives far more reliably than armor ever could. Below her, the team slipped into the gulch. No sound, no signals, just shadows vanishing between ferns. A drone, she now heard its faint hum, circled overhead. Visibility was compromised, but probably not enough to lose the thermal feed. They'd definitely spot the heat signature of a lone shooter holding position, and that precisely was the whole point. She lifted the enemy radio again, letting it ping just once. A beacon, a final deliberate deception. The hillside behind her flashed once more with another round of return fire. She ducked, pulling herself tighter behind a broken tree trunk. One round struck a stone just above her head, another clipped the side of her vest and knocked her backward. But thankfully it didn't penetrate. She grunted, rolled, and stubbornly kept firing. 2 minutes. Then the sound subtly shifted. Rotors, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. The Black Hawk was coming in fast, low, right under the canopy. Quinn could actually see the treetops bending and swaying from its powerful approach. Her team was already marking smoke at the LZ below. They were almost there. Quinn reached for another magazine and slammed it home with a practiced click. She gave one last burst of suppressive fire, then began falling back, step by step, meticulously watching every shadow, listening for any sign of pursuit. When she finally reached the gully's edge, she stopped and looked back just once, just enough to see the smoke beginning to clear, just enough to know the enemy was still fixated on the ridge, expecting her team to be dug in. They weren't. They were almost gone, and Quinn, remarkably, was still breathing. The gulch offered virtually no cover, just packed earth, broken rock, and shoulder-high brush scattered too thinly to hide anything effectively. Quinn ran near the front, her rifle clutched across her chest, her breath ragged, her legs burning with exertion. Behind her, the team moved in staggered bursts, bounding pairs, leaping forward while others turned and fired short, precise bursts into the trees. The gunfire seemed to chase them like a relentless drumbeat, never quite close enough to land a hit, but never far enough to ignore. A wounded seal leaned heavily on another, stumbling every few steps, but stubbornly refusing to stop. One of the hostages had to be practically half-dragged, his legs weak, his eyes glazed over with fear or exhaustion or both. The others moved better, driven perhaps by pure fear or shock. Quinn didn't speak. She just kept pushing forward, her eyes scanning relentlessly for the plume of smoke they had thrown to mark the extraction zone. The Black Hawk was incredibly close now. She could hear the rotors, low and heavy, cutting through the air like a blade too massive to miss. 200 meters, her second-in-command called out, his voice tight, strained behind clenched teeth. Quinn raised a hand in acknowledgement, then pointed to the left. A narrow outcrop offered partial elevation. She signaled for one man to provide cover from there, and he peeled off without a word, dropping into a prone position just as another round of gunfire cracked through the brush. The shots were high, hurried. The enemy was clearly rushing now, desperately trying to get a last angle before the bird arrived. A smoke grenade burst open ahead, its gray plume curling ominously through the heat. Dust swirled up around their boots, and visibility plummeted. But that was, of course, the whole point. They disappeared into the hazy chaos, moving even faster, pushing through thorns, roots, and loose gravel until the tree line finally fell away and the clearing opened up before them. The Black Hawk hovered 30 feet off the ground, its nose angled slightly down, rotors pulling air like a thunderclap. Its crew leaned out the doors, scanning for friendlies, shouting over the deafening engine roar. One pointed and waved them in urgently. Another fired a burst from the side-mounted weapon just to keep the tree line in check. Quinn raised her arm and waved twice. The signal was confirmed. The team surged forward, a desperate rush. The first to reach the ramp immediately began helping the hostages aboard, pulling them in 2 at a time. One tried to stand prematurely before being hauled down and securely strapped into the side bay. The medic followed, still applying pressure to a tourniquet as he climbed aboard. Quinn herself helped lift the limping seal onto the ramp. A crewman quickly grabbed his harness and dragged him the rest of the way in. Gunfire picked up again, much closer now. Rounds smacked into the dirt right beside them. A burst ripped through the low brush near the tail, and another snapped past Quinn's left arm, striking the side of the bird with a sharp metallic ping. She turned to cover the flank when she suddenly saw one of her team stumble near the outer edge of the clearing. He went down on one knee, then flat. No scream, no call-out, just down. Quinn didn't even think. She just reacted. She sprinted back into the open, low and fast. Dirt kicked up beside her as bullets found her trail. She dropped beside him, quickly checking the wound on his shoulder. It was high, bleeding fast. But he was conscious and understandably scared. He reached for her hand, and she instinctively grabbed his wrist. "You're not done," she stated, and he nodded once, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. She hauled him up, his arms slung over her shoulder, his feet slipping precariously in the churned-up earth. The helicopter crew, spotting them, immediately started toward the ramp. 2 SEALs reached down as she neared, grabbing his harness first. She let go and gave him a decisive shove forward. He rolled onto the deck and was quickly dragged clear. Then she felt it, a sharp sting. Not deep, just a graze across the forearm, burning more from friction than actual pain. She simply ignored it. "Get her in," someone shouted urgently. Quinn turned and ran the final few steps. The ramp vibrated violently under her boots as the helicopter shifted, angling to take off. She jumped, hitting the deck hard, and rolled behind the gunner's shield just as another burst slammed into the rear fuselage. One round ricocheted off the armor plate near the tail. Another buried itself into the dirt below. The crew chief slammed the ramp control and the door swiftly rose as the Black Hawk finally lifted off, tail first, clearing the treetops in one powerful sweep. Below them, the jungle seemed to ripple and churn under the intense rotor wash. Quinn leaned her head against the wall, breathing hard, her eyes closed for just a fleeting second. The team was safely inside, the hostages were alive, and the wounded seemed stable. She opened her eyes and looked out the side window. Enemy fighters emerged at the very edge of the clearing just as they cleared altitude. Clearly too late. Their weapons were raised for a moment, then slowly lowered. One of them angrily threw a hand signal toward the canopy. Frustration etched in every single motion. Quinn didn't smile, didn't speak. She reached across her vest, pulled the damaged enemy radio from her pouch, and simply dropped it beside her. The last transmission from the traitor hadn't finished the job, and now it never would. The helicopter banked left, and the dense jungle faded into a blur of cloud and smoke. She exhaled once, a long, slow breath, and finally let the silence return. The Black Hawk touched down gently on the open pad behind the forward operating base. The rotors were still winding down as medics rushed forward, stretchers at the ready. Floodlights painted the gravel in long, stark streaks of white. Dust swirled at knee level. The first stretcher cleared the bird just before Quinn herself stepped off. Her plate carrier was streaked with dirt, blood and sweat. One glove was torn across the palm. The grime on her face had dried into uneven, stark lines, catching noticeably in the creases beneath her eyes. She walked beside one of the wounded until the medic team fully took over. He was conscious, breathing slowly, still gripping the strap of his sling as they carefully lifted him. Quinn crouched just once, touching the edge of his shoulder with 2 fingers, then stood again without a word. The hostages were led away by base security, their faces pale, some limping, none speaking. One paused as he passed her, their eyes briefly locking. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thin from exhaustion. She gave a slight nod, nothing more. He didn't seem to expect it. Inside the hangar, the intel team busily unpacked the recovered gear, weapons, field maps, and those crucial radios. The traitor's encrypted handset had already been quickly disassembled. A tech waved someone over, pointing at new coordinates coming through on a screen. Quinn heard them call for a debriefing, heard her name mentioned in the same breath as command and follow on. She kept walking, moving outside the compound wall beyond the harsh light spill of the pad. The air was quiet out here, just the chirping of crickets now and the distant reassuring hum of generators. She moved past the line of fuel drums, past the very last Humvee, until only her boots and her long stretched shadow reached toward the trees. Her second-in-command followed, stopping just short of her. "We don't blame you," he said, his voice quiet enough to almost vanish in the wind. "Wind didn't turn. Doesn't matter," she replied simply. He stayed a moment longer, then left her there. She stood alone at the very edge of the floodlight's wash, her arms loose at her sides, her shoulders stiff with tension. Her shadow stretched across the dirt, long and distorted by the angle of the beam. The night, she knew, hadn't ended. It had only changed location. She watched the horizon, unmoving. If this story lingered with you, maybe take a moment to reflect who truly are the quiet ones in your own world. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow for more stories that genuinely honor strength without needing a spectacle.